Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and welcome to those of you who are here to this opening session on the second day of the conference. Obviously, as per the agenda, the presentation or the panel today will be for the presentation of this year's joint declaration by the special rapporteurs and representatives for freedom of expression and media freedoms from the UN, OAS, OSCE and African Commission. Before we get going, allow me a moment to congratulate our co-hosts of the conference on what I believe is the 25th anniversary of the restoration of the Day of Independence. Yesterday we had some fantastic singing on this stage. We haven't pre-planned any choral singing from this panel, but the panelists are more than welcome to sing if they wish. But I hope that later on today we'll be enjoying some singing in Riga. This year, we've had some turnover, if that's the right word, but we've had some new faces on the panel. Let me introduce them very briefly. Obviously, immediately, well, going from my left and across the panel, we have David Kaye, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression. To his left, Edison Lanza, the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression for the Organization of American States. To his left, Juan Barata, the Principal Advisor of the OSCE Representative of Freedom of the Media. To his left, we have Toby Mendel, the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Democracy. And to his left, we have Barbara Bukowska, Article 19 Senior Director for Law and Policy. And my name is Thomas Hughes, as the slide says, and I'm the Executive Director of Article 19. Unfortunately, Dunja Mijatovič, the OSCE representative for freedom of the media, was unable to join us today. She's in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, attending the Freedom Online Coalition conference, and I believe undertaking the first mission to Mongolia for the OSCE office. And of course, last but certainly not least, Pansy Takula, who is the African Commission Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information, who is, of course, today attending the ordinary session of the African Commission. Just a couple of brief words about the joint declaration. So for those of you, and I see many familiar faces, so I think most of you are aware of what the joint declaration represents, but for those of you who haven't come across a joint declaration before, this document is really the centerpiece of the collaboration between these mandate holders. They have produced a joint declaration every year since 1999, so this is the 16th one. The goal of the joint declaration is for the mandate holders to identify a key issue of current concern that we see in the global freedom of expression landscape, and the output is to try and provide guidance to states and other actors about progressive free expression standards, and also for the creation of soft law. I'm not going to say almost anything at this stage, actually, about the content of the joint declaration, because the purpose of this presentation is obviously for the mandate holders to speak about that. But very briefly, as you will see in the agenda, it is around freedom of expression and contexts of conflict and crisis. I think during yesterday we had many examples of ongoing domestic and international conflict, of problems created by organized crime, certainly of terrorist attacks. So this is exactly the subject matter that we will be addressing during the course of today. The joint declaration, if you don't have a copy with you already, is available at the back of the room in English, Arabic and French, and I believe there will be subsequent other languages available. This year, we are going to try and do a slightly different style of presentation. So we will not be going simply down the panelists and having long presentations. Instead, we've agreed to go for a lightning talk format. This will demand, hopefully, audience participation. So I know it's the first panel of the day, but a lot of enthusiasm, please. Each panelist will talk for a maximum of 5 minutes. They will find me hovering over them if they speak for longer. They all have chosen a theme to speak about within the joint declaration. And then immediately following their 5 minutes, we will go for a maximum of 2 questions from the floor, and then we will move on to the next lightning presentation. Dunja and Pansy have made pre-recorded statements that we will have showing behind us, splitting up the course of the presentations. We have 2, 3 microphones in the room. I do not see the individuals holding them. Right, there we go. We've got one up there, another one over here, and hopefully if we can get one down the front, if the third person can come down here. If you have a question, even during the course of the presentation, stick your hand up, get the microphone, and be ready to ask the question straight away. We only have 60 minutes. We have a number of lightning talks to get through, so we're going to keep the pace going as fast as we can. I will stop here, and I will hand over to David Kaye, who's going to introduce the theme of non-state actors and their responsibilities. So, David, over to you.
So, thank you, Tom. So I'm going to dispense with all the nice complimentary things that we usually start with, since I have such little time. First, just want to say very briefly that the collaboration among rapporteurs, I think, is an essential part of all of our work. So whether it's Edison or Pansy or Dunja, we're all working together quite regularly. And I wanted to mention that as really an introduction, because the joint declaration is both a reflection of the collaboration, but also in a way the tip of the iceberg, because we're working so much together, and it's something that I value very much, and just since I've started in August, have valued really every day of the mandate. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about non-state actors, and in doing that, I'm going to hopefully not too pedantically talk about what the law is, but there's a punchline at the end, and sort of to give away the game at the beginning. That punchline is that states have obligations to impose obligations in turn on non-state actors and to hold them accountable for attacks, in our context, attacks on journalists, but attacks on freedom of expression generally. So what the joint declaration provides, and I'll just read it, is in the context of systematic attacks on freedom of expression, non-state actors bear direct responsibility for their actions where these represent breaches of domestic law or of international humanitarian or criminal law. So what does this mean? I think that first it suggests, because of this line, where these represent breaches of domestic law, it suggests that human rights law, first and foremost, imposes obligations on states. It doesn't impose directly obligations on non-state actors, with some exceptions that I'll get to in a second. So the key point is that states have obligations. Now, what are those obligations? I think the overarching obligation of states is to respect and ensure respect of the provisions of human rights law. So the respect part is easy, right? They're essentially negative obligations, which means states have obligations to avoid imposing undue constraints on freedom of expression, and really positive obligations to ensure that there's space for freedom of expression. But the ensure respect part is also critical, and I think that's in some ways the hook for many of us when we're thinking about how to impose obligations or to ensure that states are imposing obligations on non-state actors. So they must ensure, states must ensure that everyone has the right to enjoy the rights guaranteed by human rights law. So that can come in any number of categories. The two that I would mention is states, first and foremost, I would say, have an obligation to ensure the right to life. And that means the right to life for everyone, and that means the right to life for those who are exercising their freedom of expression. As we look around the world, particularly on World Press Freedom Day, we see that states either don't have the legislation necessary to ensure the respect for the right to life or the freedom of expression, or they have that law and they're not ensuring that respect. So I think it's critical for us to continue to put pressure on states and to remind states of this obligation under human rights law to ensure respect. Now, the area where we can identify very specific obligations on non-state actors, and I'm using this phrase, I realize I've been saying non-state actors, it's a very kind of vanilla phrase, but non-state actors refers to something that we think about, I think, quite regularly over the past year, which is terrorists, but it can also mean others. It can mean corporate actors. It can mean any non-state actor that there should be obligations on. Now, in international humanitarian law or international criminal law, non-state actors have obligations, whether we're talking about armed conflict, international or non-international civil conflict, or we're talking about situations of peace. So, for example, if we look at the jurisprudence of the international criminal tribunals for Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and Rwanda, we can see that there have been cases brought consistently against actors that weren't specifically states at the time that they were operating. And so it's easy to talk in terms of war crimes and such. So if we're talking about a place like Syria, for example, particularly when we look at the Islamic State and we see its control of territory, I think it's very easy to identify that there are obligations on actors like the Islamic group. But also in the context of crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity do not require us to identify a link to armed conflict. So systematic or widespread attacks on civilians, which includes journalists, are prohibited, and that's an obligation directly on non-state actors. So for all of these things, I assume I'm coming up close to my 5 minutes. For all of these areas, I think we see that either states have obligations to impose those obligations and to hold accountable non-state actors, or in different situations, non-state actors have direct obligations not to attack journalists or any other civilians. And I think that part of our goal in the joint declaration was to emphasize this point, that states need to be ensuring that respect and that protection for journalists and other civilians in the context of conflict.
Thank you, David. So, any quick-fire questions to David? I don't want to have to call people's names out. Yes, we have one down here. Thank you.
Thanks. Hello, can you hear me? Yes, you can now. My name is Julie Pizzetti. I'm with Wanifra and University in Australia called Wollongong. I've just finished a study which is now with UNESCO looking at source protection in the digital age, which I hope will be published and have an impact. And I'm wondering, in the context of this discussion, whether there can be consideration not just for the safety of journalists, but also for the safety of journalists' sources, which then reflects also on the safety of journalists in terms of the surveillance issues, David, that you were raising yesterday and others. So I'm just wondering whether there is any room, probably not at this stage in this declaration, but how we might address that issue as well. So
thank you for the question. I mean, very briefly, I would just say two things. The first is that I want to talk with you after the panel. My next report, the report that I issued to the General Assembly in October, will focus on protection of sources of journalists, including whistleblowers. So I think there's a lot of room to develop law and practice around that, although I would say, sort of in answer specifically to your question, I think when we talk about protection of journalists, we should include within that ambit the protection of sources for journalists. As every journalist knows, they can't do their work without sources, and the protection of their anonymity, the protection of their physical security can be as important as their own security. And so when we're looking at protections and when we're thinking about attacks on freedom of expression, it absolutely includes civilians, journalists, sources who are all sort of one and the same.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David. Next, we're going to go on to Dunja Mijatovič. This is going to be a video-recorded message. And Dunja is going to speak to us about conflict and restrictions on the media.
Dear colleagues, friends, and press freedom advocates around the world, thank you very much for this opportunity to address you today. I was really hoping to join you in Riga for this important event, but as you know, I'm attending the Freedom Online Coalition conference in Ulaanbaatar, and I'm also paying the first official visit to Mongolia, and Mongolia is the youngest participating state of the OSCE. Of course, we will be discussing ways to make sure the rights generally available to traditional media are also extended to our colleagues using the internet. As I speak today, journalists across the OSCE region and beyond, which I observe and report on, as well as journalists worldwide, are in danger. No more so than in and around Ukraine, where journalists and journalism itself has been under attack for more than a year. While I'm talking about Ukraine specifically, what is happening there is also taking place on other continents and regions where war rages. The issues are worldwide in scope. The death toll of journalists in Ukraine approaches 10, with literally hundreds more having been the victim of attacks. Scores have been abducted or detained. Editorial offices of television and radio stations and newspapers have been vandalized. Attacks of any kind are simply not acceptable. Journalist safety must be guaranteed at all times, and those responsible for crimes against journalists must be brought to justice to prevent an environment of intimidation, fear, and impunity from taking hold. But we also face an enemy that may have the power to destroy all we hold dear: the uncontrolled proliferation of propaganda. Propaganda is another ugly scar, an evil on the face of modern journalism. And in the battles in and around Ukraine, it rages unabated. Propaganda is especially dangerous when it dominates the public domain and crowds out real news, thereby distorting the marketplace of ideas. And state media is the main vehicle of propaganda. I call on governments, wherever they own media outlets, directly or by proxy, to stop corrupting the profession, to stop spreading propaganda. Because in the absence of real, critical journalism, democracy suffers, and deliberate disinformation is the daily standard. Simply put, I call on governments across the world to get out of the news business. But I also believe it is time for journalists themselves, along with their professional associations and self-regulatory bodies, to take a long, hard look in the mirror and evaluate their role and consider the content they are producing. The propaganda evident in media today does a disservice to all credible, ethical journalists who have fought for and, in some cases, given their lives to produce real news. On this date of commemoration and celebration, I humbly suggest that all of us who have a stake in free media and free expression commit ourselves to changing the current dismal landscape of violence and intimidation and control, and get back to our roots and our strength: good, honest journalism, written without fear or distortion. I firmly believe we can do this. Happy World Press Freedom Day.
So if that has provoked any questions, I would ask you to hold on to those, and I think we will put them to Juan after he has spoken, as he can speak to that from an OSCE perspective. So next up, Edison Lanza will talk to us about violence against journalists perpetrated by organized crime. Edison.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, I would like to address some key points about the extreme violence against the journalists. The motives behind the violence against journalists in the region are complex. Mostly this type of violence is still perpetrated by state actors, especially in the context of public safety operations and public demonstrations, or in cases involving allegations of corruption or illegal acts committed by authorities. Local authorities in particular. Nevertheless, in recent years, the number and size of criminal organizations has increased, including drug traffic, cartels, and other organization criminal groups. These currently represent one of the main threats journalists face to their lives and integrity. In some places, state institutions are too weak to respond effectively to the threats from organized crimes. The weakness of the state institutions leaves journalists without effective protection from these threats behind the organized crime, and the immediate effect is the self-censorship. A second challenge to protect journalists from organized crime is that in some places the local institutions themselves are infiltrated or captured by the criminal groups. In that context, journalists are threatened both by organized crimes and by the governments, by the official governments who have been charged with defending them. place them in grave situation of vulnerability. A third situation that seriously compromises the safety of journalists in areas affected by organized crime is when the state authorities combat this phenomenon using institutional standards of action that are not appropriate of that act, like a war mentality and the mentality of the friendly enemy that identifies media critical of them with the enemy they are fighting. Despite the seriousness, the violence perpetrated against journalists to prevent them from informing society on matters that are not notably in the public interest. The situation of impunity has not improved in the region. This joint declaration called the states to have an obligation to take effective measures to prevent attacks against journalists and others exercising their rights to freedom of expression and to combat impunity, in particular by vigorously condemning such attacks when they do occur, by investigating them promptly and effectively in order to duly sanction those responsible, and by providing compensation to the victims where it's appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. So are there any questions, quick-fire questions to Edison? If not, let me jump in here with a question myself then. So you describe contexts in which the rule of law no longer applies often, particularly in local contexts and across the region that you're responsible for. What recommendations do you make to journalists? What can your office offer in terms of assistance to those individuals who are suffering these violations?
Yes, the recommendation is like the state have the obligation to protect them in first time to investigate the case when occurred. And second, it's they prevent this situation of violence. First of all, the authorities do not take declaration that is stigmatized journalists. And then when the cases occur, it's the obligation of the state that investigate and sanction this situation. No? And then in the context of the Latin America region, the Office of the Special Rapporteur, it's adopt special measures when the countries have a structural situation of violence. And then some countries like Colombia and Mexico, now Guatemala, is being start to have some programs, special programs to protect journalists.
And we have the second question over here. Do we have a microphone?
My name is Mogens Blikker Bjergård, UNESCO IPDC and the European Federation of Journalists. It was actually the last point you gave that I wanted to ask a question about, namely Colombia and the mechanisms made in Colombia. How much impact that have, and will that could that be copied in other Latin American countries? The mechanism where the journalists can be protected very fast.
Yes, the program of Colombia, the program of protection of journalists, is the oldest in the region. Have until 8 years now, and then the first conclusion of this implementation, this program, is that the lowest number of murder of journalists. Colombia improved the situation in terms of evitar, it's like avoid the murder of journalists. But the second conclusion that it's a very complex program that have a high bureaucracy to improve that. And then it's very expensive in terms of the cost of this. It's a situation that is not sustainable in sustainable in terms of the time, even for the another countries like that don't have the similar budget to building this type of program.
Okay, Edison, thank you very much. Next we have an audio message from Pansy Takula, so that will play on the next slide. And she will be speaking about terrorist attacks and suppression of freedom of expression.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you on this day. Unfortunately, I could not join you for the launch of our joint declaration because I am currently in the Gambia for the 56th ordinary session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. I welcome this comprehensive declaration because it comes at the time when a number of countries on the African continent, including Cameroon, Niger, Tunisia, Somalia, Libya, Kenya, and Nigeria, are facing unprecedented terrorism attacks. The declaration is also being launched against the background of xenophobic attacks in South Africa and the eruption of violence in Burundi, occasioned by the decision of the president of that country to seek a third term in office. Although there are different reasons for the conflict in each of these countries, the common denominator, however, is that in almost all of them, freedom of expression and access to information are casualties. Terrorism has no place in a democracy and should be dealt with decisively. Perpetrators thereof should face the full might of the law. However, in dealing decisively with terrorism, it is not a solution for governments to impose disproportionate restrictions on free expression and free flow of information, the consequence of which is unavoidably self-censorship. Our governments should, in this regard, always be guided by well-established international human rights norms and standards on the limitation of free expression. As we commemorate World Press Freedom Day, we should always remember media practitioners, journalists, and other free speech activists who lost their lives in the line of duty, and those who continue to operate in conflict areas at great cost and danger to their lives in order to keep all of us informed. These include a number of journalists in the Gambia where I am currently. And in their remembrance, I will be celebrating the World Press Freedom Day with the Gambian Press Union. I wish my colleagues a successful launch of the 2015 declaration, and it is my hope that it will be used by all free expression activists to improve the situation of freedom of expression and access to information in the world. I thank you.
So again, if you have any questions relating to Pansy's presentation, I would ask you to hold on to those and to put them either to Toby or Barbara as they take their turn to give a small talk. So next, we will turn to Juan Barata Mia. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning. I will make just a few remarks in addition to what has already been said by the representative on freedom of the media. As it has already been noted, protection of freedom of expression does not only imply, let's say, refraining from introducing restrictions, but also implies the obligation by states to facilitate the exercise of freedom of expression, to create the conditions for an effective and real exercise of such right. This is why, and I would say that these conditions include not only legal conditions or a legal framework, but also, let's say, material conditions that have to be provided by the states, as I said, in order to be able to talk about a full enjoyment of freedom of expression, particularly in times of conflict. This is why in the joint declaration, and I quote, one of the principles, one of the general principles relates to this issue, and it states that states should take measures to ensure that all groups in society have access to opportunities to make their voices heard, both within their communities and in wider social debates. And here we refer to several different positive measures. Probably the most important one, and I mentioned that in the panel yesterday, and it was mentioned this morning by the representative on freedom of the media, is to ensure media plurality, media pluralism, diversity of voices within the public sphere. This is the best antidote to propaganda. We cannot avoid in free societies the existence of intolerant, extreme voices. So the best way to fight them, to counter them, is not to prohibit, but to provide, to facilitate the existence of a vibrant public sphere. And this means that, I mean, this doesn't mean, or it's not enough, to have just a huge number of media outlets. Sometimes we hear, particularly state officials saying, we have no problems of media freedom in my country, we have 200 newspapers. But then if you look at these newspapers, you see that, I mean, 99.9% of them are controlled by the state, or companies that are related to the state, etc. So media diversity is more than numbers, is more than a huge amount of media outlets. It's about the existence of a wide range of media outlets that represent different sectors of society. Here I would also include the importance of reforming state media into genuine public service broadcasting. We see that in many states public service broadcasting doesn't exist yet, even if in some laws they call them public broadcasters, they are still state broadcasters. But another tendency that we have seen in some countries is closing down existing public service broadcasters. And here, just as an example, in times of crisis, in Greece, Greeks, probably in the last moment of the crisis, of the economic crisis, they lost an important source of information. And our office, the representative of freedom of the media, criticized that. And only last week we welcomed the fact that a new law in Greece was approved in order to reintroduce public service broadcasting. So it's not only about reform of state media, but also preserving public service broadcaster. All the positive measures relate to access to information laws, of course, and transparency. And we saw in one of the site events on Saturday the importance of transparency in business and media ownership. Legal certainty, of course, I mean, states need to protect legal certainty because this is the basic precondition for the exercise of freedom of expression without the so-called chilling effect. A proper legal framework and law enforcement system that prevents, of course, any abuse either coming from the private sector or the public sector in order to ensure respect. This is something that has been mentioned before. And finally, the promotion and proper understanding of, we mentioned here, citizen journalism. At the OSCE we have a project called Open Journalism. We cannot open a discussion here about open journalism, but I think that the important thing here is that states need to effectively promote these new forms of communication, these new forms of journalism, basically as a starting point, but recognizing that freedom of expression should be protected both online and offline. Internet is just a platform where life takes place. So everything that takes place in the internet is part of life, and is part of life should be protected in the same way as it is protected in the offline world. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Any quick-fire questions? So let me put one to you. The concern would be that when we talk about diversity, it leads us into a discussion about state regulation and possibly regulation of content. So what positive measures, what are the red lines in terms of regulation and diversity and content in terms of combating conflict situations?
Well, I mean, about promotion of diversity and pluralism, I would say that structural regulations are much preferable than content regulation. And by structural regulations, I mean those regulations which are aimed not at controlling what is said, but the structure of the market, the structure of the public sphere, in order to avoid an excessive concentration of communication powers in certain hands. I think that this is different from just telling journalists you need to say that, or even these rules on internal pluralism. I understand that internal pluralism can be imposed on public service broadcasters, but in order to achieve what we usually call external pluralism, I think that the best way is not to tell different media outlets what they need to say, but basically to promote and structure a public sphere which is as open, as diverse as possible. And I think that here, I mentioned before public service broadcasting, but I think it's also worth mentioning community media in this area as well. And probably, I mean, in the analog world, we had, I mean, these discussions about licensing, how to license, how to better protect, I mean, how to guarantee a perfect or the best access to the public sphere. But now in the digital world, probably this discussion has changed because everybody has access. Now probably the problem is about visibility, and the role that intermediaries play, not only states, but intermediaries play in order to facilitate this visibility in the digital world. But of course, this is part of a wider discussion.
Yeah, and we have a second question down at the front.
Thank you. Regarding your explanation there, in an authoritarian context, doesn't structural diversification lead to the possibility of weakening the independent media that might be able to withstand government pressure?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the first precondition is for that is to get rid of this authoritarian kind of scheme. I mean, within an authoritarian context, nothing can work. Huh? So, I mean, democracy is a precondition. A truly democratic system is a precondition for the existence of diversity. And I cannot think of any case of authoritarian systems where they have a proper structural diverse media system. I don't know what we were thinking, or which case we were thinking of.
Well, I can think of several. I'm from Latin America. I can think of several cases in Latin America where governments which are not exactly friendly to freedom of expression, who want to control freedom of expression, are trying for structural reform, attacking the major news organizations that have some degree of independence from the government.
No, I see your point. Yes, yeah, no, that's right, no, absolutely. I mean, now, I mean, and we were discussing with Edison about some of these cases just before the start. Of course, I mean, the main aim of, let's say, structural diversity is not to, I mean, engage in liaison dangereuse with economic powers. The problem in Latin America is that we were saying that in Europe we have moved from public monopoly to private liberalization, and probably in Latin America we have many cases of private monopolies moving towards, let's say, some degree of liberalization and even the introduction of public service broadcasters, etc., etc. So breaking a private monopoly probably it's even more difficult than breaking a public monopoly, because the private monopolies probably has a very intense relationship with the power, and at the same time it has the capacity to condition media policies, because Of course, governments in these cases are in the hands of these very powerful media corporations that dominate the public sphere, and without them they cannot win the elections. So this is a very difficult relationship, but I see, honestly, I think that probably it is a shortcoming in many Latin American countries, the fact that, as far as I know, most of them, they don't have anti-concentration, they don't have measures or laws to protect pluralism.
Thank you, Juan. And next, I'll pass over to Toby Mendel, who will be talking to us about privacy and administrative measures.
Thank you. Tom introduced us all under the rubric of new faces, and I would like to stress that I am most decidedly an old face. I'm not talking here about my age, although if I look at the panel, I might be able to make some claims in that sphere as well, but rather the fact that since the very inception of these joint declarations, I have been involved with them. So I'm talking about two issues, privacy and administrative measures. And let me start with the administrative measures, and actually I think this goes somewhat to the last question. And the declaration reiterates that all administrative regimes which directly impact freedom of expression should be overseen by independent bodies. So I think the kinds of cases you're talking about in Latin America particularly and in other places, the regulator is not independent, and that's a core part of the problem. And those claims in terms of media regulators have been made in previous joint declarations. Where this joint declaration goes, I think, significantly further is that it talks about all direct administrative measures. And I'll give you an example from my own country, Canada, where the government is about to pass a law that would give the minister responsible for security the power to seize or take down terrorist propaganda. As far as I'm concerned, this rule that we're putting forward in the joint declaration would rule out that kind of measure as well. The statement also makes very clear standards in terms of absolutely prohibiting things like communications kill switches, taking down the internet, taking down mobile phone systems, state filtering of the internet, absolutely rules those sorts of things out, and state takeover of broadcasting stations. So I think it's very clear and emphatic statements about those kinds of administrative measures. In terms of privacy, in the last few years, if it wasn't clear before, I think we can all see now the close relationship between respect for privacy and respect for freedom of expression, and the statement reiterates that relationship. But it goes on to make several very important points about privacy and freedom of expression. The first point it makes is that mass surveillance is, and I'm quoting, inherently disproportionate. So it rules out any system of mass surveillance and calls instead only for targeted surveillance as justified by the three-part restriction on freedom of expression under international law. I think that's a very, very important statement in the modern world. We see this debate, vibrant debate globally about these issues. In the United States now, there's bipartisan support for revising the surveillance regime there that would move significantly closer to the targeted surveillance that we're calling for. Not entirely, I don't think, but much closer to that. And it also rules out, in the same way, mass retention of personal data for law enforcement and security purposes. So in Europe, we saw the European Court of Justice struck down the Data Retention Directive, and this statement sort of globalizes that, if you will. It makes a couple of other statements about surveillance. It says that the rules governing surveillance should always be transparent and open. Obviously, the particular implementation of those rules, that's to say the application of surveillance measures, will not always be transparent, or not transparent perhaps until later. But the system for surveillance must be transparent. There must be independent oversight of that system. Again, I think a fairly well-established principle. And very importantly as well, and to close with, it says that encryption and anonymity tools enable freedom of expression, and they should never be prohibited or impeded except in exceptional cases as justified by the three-part test for restrictions. Again, a very live and current debate with different states sort of wanting keys and controls over encryption, and I think that this statement basically says that those things are not legitimate. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. There's a question at the back.
Thank you very much. William Horsley from the Centre for Freedom of the Media, University of Sheffield. It's for David Kaye in particular, but any of you, the very old but very urgent question of implementation of the obligations, especially these proactive, positive obligations that you're emphasising in this declaration. In many parts of the world, you have an unwillingness by states to conform with their obligations. In places like Europe, the Council of Europe, one solution has been to transpose the convention principles into national law, and that's brought an enormous number of successes in actually bringing compliance with the rules. But we heard, for example, from the Russian Union of Journalists representative yesterday that we feel that as journalists in a country like Russia, we simply have to fight by ourselves. We have to do it in our own way on the ground. So what hope can you give us, or what would you point to as the means by which these international norms and standards can actually be made to stick where the governments are unwilling? Is there anything that the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights can do to impose the international standards at national level? What about the UNESCO audit system of impunity in cases of killings of journalists, or do journalists have to do it by themselves?
Well, I mean, this is a little bit similar to the last question. I think, I mean, if we look at the context of the joint declarations, they don't provide necessarily for a sequencing of measures. So if we have states like Russia where the rule of law is not even respected and where, you know, basic protections for freedom of expression are not in place, then some of the more subtle measures that we're talking about, particularly those positive measures, I think, you know, we can't sort of start with that. You know, the joint declarations are the sort of an idealized statement of international law, but where you start to transition from a non-democratic, non-rule of law type of situation towards, you know, one where there's respect for freedom of expression, I think is a question of tactics in the particular circumstance of the country. I mean, I know that's perhaps not, you know, not entirely satisfactory answer, but we can't sort of say, well, it's this and this and this, because that really does depend on the country. I mean, I'm doing a lot of work these days in Myanmar, which is undertaking a rapid transition towards democracy with some wobbles. And sort of the first measures that the state put in place were to put in place exactly the structural regulation of the media issues. And what we've seen in the aftermath of that is an escalation of cases of defamation, still criminal defamation, and journalists getting put in prison for that. So these sorts of uneven transitions towards democracy always basically happen, and hopefully they will tackle the defamation next, as it were. But I mean, I think there's, you know, the sequencing is a case-by-case kind of issue.
I mean, I would only want to add to that I think there are several places, you mentioned one, where it looks hopeless in terms of advocacy and essentially kind of building law in a particular country and implementation. And in those kinds of situations, like Toby, I agree, the subtle application of law isn't going to work. And so I think it's part of our obligation, and by our obligation I mean, you know, rapporteurs, but other mechanisms in international and regional institutions to continue to put pressure for the implementation. And so I think that's also a responsibility of those of you in the room to take, and Barbara's going to talk about this in a moment, to take the principles that we're talking about in the joint declaration, but also the basic law that's in the ICCPR or in the European Convention, and to make use of them. I know there are some in this room who do litigation that uses these principles, whether in the European system or in national systems, and I think that's important, and we need to increase that use of law in order to continually say to states, you're violating your obligation, you're non-compliant, you need to change either your practice or your law in order to be compliant with it.
So, Toby, let me ask you also one quick question. We often see states, particularly in context of conflict, of course, we often see states drop the word emergency into justifications as to why they're introducing restrictions. But under what circumstances can states actually derogate rights in a state of emergency? What do they have to actually do to do that?
Right. So under the ICCPR, derogations are only legitimate in the context of threats to the life of the nation, which means sort of, very fundamental attacks on the existence of the state, much more profound than the kinds of, when we describe conflict situations, here we're talking about a much lower level of problem, sort of even fairly widespread terrorist attacks or organized crime situations don't amount to threats to the life of the nation. Of course, the vast majority of states of emergency that we actually see around the world are not like that. Egypt was under a 30-year state of emergency under Mubarak, wasn't sort of under threat to its very life. The other point, of course, is that in states of emergency, you can only derogate as strictly required by the exigencies of the situation, to quote the ICCPR. So it doesn't mean that just because there's a state of emergency, you can mallet freedom of expression. I mean, you have to say, we need this precise measure limiting freedom of expression, because without that, we really cannot deal with that threat to the life of the nation. And we had an interesting debate among ourselves in the drafting of this declaration about the exact wording to use for restrictions on freedom of expression in states of emergency. And I think that we didn't sort of finalize that discussion, but I think that we felt that the three-part test for restrictions, which requires restrictions to be necessary, already responds to the kind of emergency situation. In other words, actually, I believe that in emergencies, you can't go beyond what's necessary anyway. So there is no special restrictions in states of emergency, just the restrictions that are always justified or not by the actual situation. So possibly sort of we're going a little wild carding on international law here, but I think what we were almost saying is that actually freedom of expression should be one of those rights that can't be derogated from states of emergency, because it already has built into it a regime of limitations that is enough, as it were.
Okay, controversial comments there. Thank you, Toby. So last, certainly not least, Barbara will be speaking to us about using the declaration. The goal of these last 5 minutes is to really try and communicate to you, the audience, how you can actually take this declaration back to your different contexts and use it in your everyday work. Barbara, over to you.
Thank you. And it's, as Toby also said, a great pleasure to assist special rapporteurs in this endeavor. And I want to highlight that this is actually the 17th joint declaration. We have had them since 1999, so it's 17 years of very fruitful and very useful collaboration between the special mandates. And as it was already stated before, that this is a really annual opportunity for the special mandates to speak as a one voice on a very important issue of freedom of expression, which is sometimes insufficiently or probably not clearly elaborated in international law in either recommendations or on a normative level. And this joint declaration this year responds to a very important issue we are dealing around the world, what is a conflict situation. And examples of these conflict situations are numerous, as we see. I'm supposed to say how we can use in this joint declaration in our work, and I want to make 3 points. The first is how the governments actually can use the joint declaration and should use the joint declaration, because they are in the joint declaration reminded about their commitments to international human rights, their international human rights obligations, how they can be expanded, defended, and protected, both online and offline. And they provide the governments with guidelines, probably not like a detailed one because it's 4 pages, but a very structured guidelines how to respond to situation in hand. So it's a sort of checklist, a basic checklist for the governments, what to do and what not to do, both in law but also in practice. So for conflict situation, which can be international or local conflicts, it can be widespread terrorist attacks or violence against journalists, what action they should not do. And one very important one is on a political level, because we have seen in many conflict situations from Charlie Hebdo or to Al-Shabaab attacks in Kenya, that they come with the political stances which exploit these attacks for their political gains, to restrict human rights and so on. So this joint declaration gives a recommendation to that extent as well, what they should not do in such situations. So they should not exploit the attacks on freedom of expression or human rights for their political ends, and they should avoid making statements which encourage discrimination or otherwise undermine equality. But they also go in detail about what to do in legal measures, not to pass strict anti-terrorism laws, broad anti-terrorism laws, or how to restrict freedom of expression in criminal laws and so on. These joint declarations are very important also for the courts. It has been mentioned already that regional bodies, such as European courts, have relied on joint declarations in their cases, in referring to them. So, for example, recently it was in a case concerning how to handle security information by journalists, but also by national courts. We have had a case in the Supreme Court in Chuvashia in Russia, which referred to a joint declaration in a case concerning the internet portal. So even national courts find them useful. And last but not least, it's very useful for NGOs, for media houses, for journalists, for lawyers to use them in advocacy for their work. So for example, Article 19, my organization, we use them very often when we analyze legislation or when we file cases to courts, but also in advocacy when we make a statement about how Charlie Hebdo attack should be dealt by the French government. Well, hopefully it will not be in the future, but in such cases you can refer to this document because you find them a very important guidelines from 4 regional bodies, and it highlights the joint response under international law and best practices, how we can use them to refer to the standard we espouse.
Barbara, thank you very much. As our hour is now up, I would ask that if you have any questions to Barbara or any of the panelists about the joint declaration or how you can use it in your daily work, please approach them or myself afterwards and take the discussion further. So please join me in thanking the panelists and Pansy and Dunja as well, of course, both for the declaration but also for this morning. Thank you.